Welcome to this Wexted podcast, Spotlight on Safe Harbour. I'm joined by two experts in the area, Andrew McCabe, my partner, and the great Michael Catchpoole from Corrs. Welcome, gentlemen. We're going to just speak generally about Safe Harbour today, and I'm going to start with a question about tenure. So it's 7 years in, the 7-year itch. Is it working? Did it begin well? Is it achieving what the ambition of the law was, Michael?
I think it is substantially achieving what was envisaged. I think there's still a degree of misunderstanding around the process, the benefits, the drawbacks. And I think that in practice, it's worked really well to extend the time in which directors have to make decisions about the future of companies in financial distress. And it's probably ended a culture of precipitous insolvency appointments. So to the extent to which it was envisaged that companies would be able to try and execute transactions outside of a formal process, I think it has been successful, but there's obviously more that can be done.
Yeah. I mean, we think the intention was good. So a slow start, we thought it wasn't that well marketed or documented. So firms like ours who were early adopters of Safe Harbour Law really had to make up a lot of the rules ourselves and determine what we were doing. Andrew, what's your reflection on how it all began?
Yeah, look, I think some directors were a bit nervous at first, but once they got into the process, they saw the benefits. And the key benefit and takeaway, most of the directors, I feel, is time. It just gives them that extra breathing space to consider their options. Some directors want to run for the door and quit before it gets too messy. Others dig in for the fight, and that breathing space that Safe Harbour gives them provides opportunity to explore all the options available to them to restructure the business and recapitalise and get it going again.
Yeah. Let's talk about how it begins then. Let's talk about commencement, because unlike voluntary administration or any other form of insolvency, there's a soft beginning for Safe Harbour. Yeah,
usually it's either the CFO or one of the board members might be nervous about solvency and insolvency going forward. They then bring us in to say, look, at what point is the perfect point to appoint. We then work with them and the rest of the board to say, look, there's a milestone or an event, and just walk them through that process.
Well, with the smaller companies, though, is it cash flow or is it a 4C that you're seeing? What is it you're seeing when people come to you?
Yeah, it's cash flow. It's really they've left a capital raise too late, or there's uncertainty to raise the money, or there's some remediation issues on mining sites. There's a few things there that just keep coming up. Usually it's cash. It comes down to cash.
There's a project that's failed, or is in an early stage, the money's run out, we need a little bit more money to get there, right? Catchy?
Yeah, I think we see a persistent pattern as well around refinancing pressure.
Yeah.
So in the context of covenant breaches or waivers, that often part of the conversation becomes, well, what's the cash flow looking like? How's this refinancing need going to be met? And there is a lot of upside in going into Safe Harbour, not a lot of downside. So the risk assessment is always in favour of trying to minimise an insolvent trading liability rather than trying to extend the time in which you're not in Safe Harbour. And for that reason, I think we're having that conversation fairly early with people and saying, well, hindsight has a confirmatory sort of effect. So if something, does in fact go badly wrong, people will say, well, all the signs were pointed in that direction in retrospect. Whereas I think in that, and given that backstory is that if the worst case does eventuate, there's no downside in having triggered it at an early point in time. Whereas there is downside in holding it back too far. So we're encouraging people to try and appoint Safe Harbour advisors and go into a Safe Harbour plan at the first sign of financial difficulty, which is often, in reality, a covenant breach.
Directors will often say to us, why are we doing this? Is it necessary? Insolvent trading's interesting. What's in this for us? And so benefits and drawbacks.
Yeah. So I think, from a legal perspective, and we can talk about some of the more practical benefits from, an accounting perspective. But from a legal perspective, that there are a couple of benefits that are not just developing a defence to some sort of later accusation that there's been a period of insolvent trading. One of the key things that's happening in a company which is got a cash flow problem or it has a covenant problem is that it's going to have to transact in the immediate future, and it's probably going to transact in circumstances which are not ideal. And one of the good things about Safe Harbour is it brings another independent advisor into the deck to advise on commercial issues, and it starts to actually help in filling out the director's duties piece of the puzzle, because it's not just a case of avoiding insolvent trading. There is a duty to take proper information and act with care. And in circumstances where there's a transaction that has to be executed, it might not be perfect from a value perspective. And I think one of the benefits of Safe Harbour is it actually puts a discipline around what you're doing and how you're doing it. And then it puts in place one of the most important things, which is a paper trail. So that if in 2 or 3 years' time there has to be an explanation about what's happened, Safe Harbour is very helpful in filling in that documentary gap and in bringing a level of discipline to the process. So I like it for that reason. I like it because it avoids the look back, but I also like it because it starts to help people with their decision making and put a layer of advice and professionalism around what is often quite a time sensitive transaction.
And when we show up, Macca, what are you seeing? Are you seeing an established course of action that's there and that it's well understood by the board and we're just helping document that, or do you think we're doing more than that? Do you think we're helping define that course of action well?
Yeah, look, the course of action's in the board's head. They know the industry better than any advisor coming in. It's in their head, and we're helping them document it, because that's a key part of it, is to document it and then also add on extra courses of action around that to document that plan and really strengthen that argument, as Michael mentioned, in terms of there's a documentary trail. If something bad does go wrong and a liquidator comes in at the end, then that's been documented the whole way through.
Yeah. Do we think that there's a vibe that's important in Safe Harbour? So it's more than insolvent trading. It's more than defeating insolvent trading. You're just operating in a far more redemptive environment. People feel more confident, feel better.
Yeah, I think it gives a layer of confidence to the directors and management that there's professional advice there. But it's also probably the case that a lot of qualified Safe Harbour entities and Safe Harbour specialists have ideas about how you navigate some of these issues that are occurring. One of the things which is interesting, I suppose, as an insolvency lawyer, sometimes coming to things, is that
there's not much interesting about being an insolvency lawyer.
No, there isn't. But it's one of the things that would be relatively interesting in the context of insolvency work is sometimes the level of sophistication or otherwise that you find that people have in navigating things like how to manage creditors, how to manage counterparties, how to have negotiations with people about these sort of issues. And often you find that when a Safe Harbour advisor comes in, there's actually an ability to start having better interactions with people because there's a more realistic appreciation about how to manage the problem. So that's one of the things that kind of goes to that environment of confidence, is that there is a facing up to it, but also there are some things that you can practically do from long experience of trading companies which are working capital constrained. And I think maybe the final piece is that having someone in there and having a documented course of action keeps everyone focused on the prize, which is executing a transaction that resolves the situation as an alternative to an administration or a liquidation or receivership.
Yeah, and we find sometimes just turning language into numbers for people is helpful. So we have a course of action, it's written down, we know what it is, but turning that into linking the cash flow to the plan and saying the plan will objectively deliver you this, we'll talk about the counterfactual in a moment, is one of the real benefits, because often people have it in their head but they haven't turned it into numbers, Macca.
Yeah, that it sharpens the focus of the directors back to the numbers, which that cash flow and building out that cash flow for the next 12 months, you can see the dips, you can see what they need to do. If they need to cut costs or raise capital, whatever it might be, they can really focus in on those key issues.
You mentioned to me earlier this concept of runway versus highway. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Yeah. So when we're talking about Safe Harbour, we sort of think about it as having a destination, and what are the guide rails around Safe Harbour, and what's the course of action, and what's reasonably likely to lead to a better outcome. So if something is reasonably likely to lead to a better outcome, it has to have an endpoint with a better outcome. So if you're on a highway to nowhere, that's not really an appropriate journey to go on, because it doesn't have that ability to meet the test of a better outcome. And sometimes Safe Harbour is a runway in the sense that it can be a relatively short and accelerative process. But if at a certain point on the runway, the plane's not going to take off, you need to pump the brakes, just like you can be going down the highway. And as long as there's a town at the end of the road, that's a fine outcome. But you have to be aware that at certain points in time, you have to pull off the highway, or you have to stop taking off from the runway, because you're not going to make it. So we look at Safe Harbour as having a series of gates, or sort of go and no-go sort of criteria. And the essential no-go is not knowing where you're going, not having a plan, not having a course of action, and simply being on a journey of sort of hopeful optimism is not what's required. It needs a discernible end. Yep.
So we have clients who sort of bump along, the share price stays like this. We've been there doing 4 or 5 reports, Macca, over an 18-month period. Are we okay with that, or should we be challenging the board more to ensure the course of action's appropriate, that it's changing? Do you think people just get into a system where we're in Safe Harbour and that's okay?
Look, I think some of them do. The good directors will see their course of action and see their destination. There will be, as Michael sort of like speed humps along the way, and the plan may change over time. But really, it comes down to the director's reasonable expectation. Is that plan realistic? Do they think they can achieve those goals? Sometimes, Joe, we come in and look at it and say, I don't think you'll be able to convert 1,000 note holders and get 100% conversion into equity to get what you need to do. But if the directors have an assumption and they think it's a reasonable expectation, that's really what's going to get tested, and that's really the focus area.
Okay, so the other side of that, the corollary to all of this, is the better outcome test. And certainly at Wexted, we undertake that fairly objectively. Do you want to talk about the process we go through to measure that?
Yeah, it's kind of similar to a voluntary administration DOCA versus liquidation comparison. We're comparing the plan versus either a liquidation or a receivership or a VA DOCA scenario. So we run certain sensitivities around, if we had our liquidators hat on, or administrators, what would be the outcome here? What would happen to contracts? What would happen to claims? What would happen to employees and redundancies? And where would that creditor stack lie? And we compare the two for each key class of creditors, secureds, unsecureds, employees, estimate the return. Each would get cents in the dollar, timing in the plan versus in the external administration.
Which Catchy takes you to objectivity, independence, qualifications, appropriately qualified entity or entities. One of the prevailing views is that this work can and should only be done by registered liquidators. That's not a view this firm shares. What do you think about AQEs, who should do this work, and in particular where lawyers sit when they're advising a company and equally trying to provide safe harbour advice?
Yeah, and it's a good question. It's a nuanced question, and there are always.
I only ask nuanced questions.
Yeah, and there are degrees of there are ways that you can address it, and I'm sure that there is a divergence of views. So having put all those weasel words in there, I think that really there are some pitfalls in having people who are not financially numerate, financial and numerate conducting safe harbour roles. And one of those key pitfalls is that you're really not well placed to make an objective assessment about the better outcome test. The other thing that I think is an interesting dynamic is that Safe Harbour is a defence for the directors. So whatever the work product is from Safe Harbour is something you're going to have to be able to show someone. And in coming to that issue about work product and showing it to someone, there's a question about whose privilege it is. If the law firm, for instance, is an appropriately qualified advisor.
You're talking about the law firm that's advising the company.
Advising the company. So is it the company's privilege?
Yes.
And if it's the company's privilege, then what's the arrangement in relation to how that privilege is shared? And then there's probably a question about whether you can properly represent the interests of the directors and the company, because the interests of the company may be divergent from the interests of the directors.
Indeed.
So whose engagement is it? There is, a scenario where if a safe harbour defence isn't properly established, that it seems to be a reasonably straightforward cause of action back to the appropriately qualified entity for the director. So there's the potential that whoever's acting as the appropriately qualified entity could, in certain circumstances, find itself as both a material witness in the case,
Indeed.
giving evidence about why they formed the view that the course of action was reasonably appropriate, and secondly, find themselves in a position where potentially, depending on the outcome of that case, or depending on the way in which that case is prosecuted, the directors might be looking to them in the event that they can't establish the safe harbour defence. So it seems to me something which is going to be tested, and it's going to be tested in circumstances where what's happened is that the better outcome test in retrospect, or that analysis, is really flawed. And one of the great things about safe harbour is that it's unobtrusive and informal. And because something's unobtrusive and informal, it's done out of court, it's not done in the public gaze, it's done in the context of a boardroom, and it's done in a confidential way. That's a great feature of the process. But at the other end, it means that you have to be very comfortable about the integrity of the way in which it's done. Because if it's not done with a high degree of intellectual rigour, it's going to be something that will be poured over in microscopic detail in 2 or 3 years' time. And, one of the things I suppose we spoke about is not leaving a rump. So if a safe harbour plan does leave a significant rump of financial liabilities which have been accumulated during the course of safe harbour, so for instance in the highway to nowhere scenario, that's where the better outcome test is under real pressure.
Indeed.
And that's where you're likely to find that the safe harbour analysis will be most vulnerable to being unpicked, as opposed to a runway scenario where you have, 6 weeks of cash and you've got to get a transaction away by week 5, or otherwise there's not enough money for the VA. So that's why I think it's really important to think about how the safe harbour is constructed, to find someone who's a specialist in safe harbour, and to find someone who is financially literate as part of that safe harbour process. So no doubt in certain circumstances, a law firm advising a director can be an appropriately qualified entity with the right financial support. But I think it's better for everyone in some respects that you have an independent safe harbour appropriately qualified entity who is, appropriately managing their relationship with the company and the directors.
And Macca, as a specialist who's financially literate, we think you're financially literate.
Thanks, Joe.
Tell me about eligibility. Do you think the eligibility rules are appropriate? Do you think, and they are going to be softened a little bit, they're getting rid of the 2 strokes rule, which we think is a good thing. Do you think eligibility is workable? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think they need to be softened or relaxed, or do you think we're in a good place where we are?
Look, I think the eligibility works. It can be softened a little bit in terms of if you lodge, if you pay your super 1 day late, does that mean you're ineligible? So there's little things like that need to be softened a little bit. But equally, I can see certain government bodies, including FEG, just itching to have a test case to really test out some of these eligibility and pierce through the safe harbour defence and try and attack certain directors to challenge some of these assumptions. And I think we do need a test case. But yeah, the eligibility, the way I see it in terms of getting your taxes lodged and your employees paid, I think that works.
Yeah. And Catchy, on the test, I agree, on the test cases, when there is one, tell me how you think that's going to work. My submission is that safe harbour advisors have been a bit lax in their reporting, their internal processing. We take all of that seriously. We ensure that our documented process is very pure and clean. We're ready to get in the box anytime. Is that your sense of safe harbour, or do you think that practitioners are a bit lackadaisical about process and they're not ready for a test case? I can think of 4 or 5 areas that will get tested heavily.
Yeah, I mean, we can all see the areas of contest which are coming, and I think the key area of contest is probably likely to be the idea of something being reasonably likely to lead to a better outcome, because that's going to require some test of either objective or subjective, and probably objective person in the position of the directors having a reasonable expectation that something's going to happen. There's going to be questions about burden and onus. But you can see that if that's how the case is going to be conducted, then it's going to be just a natural adjunct to that there's going to be an attack on the maths, there's going to be an attack on the information.
Hindsight's a great thing. Plenty of time to do these things.
Yeah, and name one business with which has got old school awards where there isn't some question of, for instance, underpayments. Like there's been no award simplification. The courts are clogged with cases about whether people are entitled to rest pauses. Like there are even the way in which the test is framed is likely to like what's substantial compliance? Is it substantial compliance if you have a rump? Because, for instance, there's been an issue with the interpretation of an award. So you can see all these things coming up. But I think the killing ground for directors will be that they have a transaction which is wholly unrealistic. And that will be the area where advisors and directors are exposed. And it's probably, to use the example of someone who has, a widely offered note or bond and they have 100% majority requirement to convert that into equity, and they've been told by a good number of those bondholders it's not going to happen. Is that a reasonable likelihood? Like, are they going to? What's your evidence base for the idea they're going to change their mind about where they sit in the capital structure or whether there's a payment default?
If we look at this redemptively, impact on boards. Macca, what are you seeing with the boards you work with? How are they feeling? How is it improving conduct? Are they feeling better after the process? Is it cost effective?
Yeah, I think it's to sum all that up, it is cost effective. We've seen some board members jump ship early. They're not even concerned, wanting to hear about the Safe Harbour. But we've seen other board members actually come into the process during the Safe Harbour. So they can see the benefits it provides. They can see the rigour, the governance. We're independent advisors along with the lawyers. We give them extra pointers to improve their minutes and improve their board pack, so that's just a more rigorous process and improves their governance along the way. So there's a lot of benefits there that I think we add to those boards. Makes those board members feel in a good position in a difficult time and allows them to take that breath and consider all their options available.
So I'm a director of a mid-sized company, say. What are the 3 or 4 things we think we would say to a group of directors is a checklist? So what should they be asking of management if they're concerned about suspicion of insolvency or suspicion of financial distress, the new term? What are 3 or 4 things you would encourage a board to look at and focus on?
Yeah, the first one I jump to is always cash flow. Ideally, it's a 12-month cash flow, but then there's also a smaller 13-week cash flow. That 12-month cash flow, it shows you the runway, shows you what you need to do. You can document the course of action and the plan along that way, which might be an equity raise, might be cutting costs, might be selling a business unit. Could be a number of things that they're doing to improve, as Michael mentioned, getting waivers on covenant breaches, giving yourself some time. So that cash flow is the number one. Number 2 is probably documentation, whether it's the Safe Harbour plan itself being documented, whether it's the board minutes, just including key things in the board pack, which, in hindsight, if a liquidator comes in 6 months later, they can see everything's been mapped out, the thought process, that the plan is realistic. If you're trying to sell a business, you think you're going to sell it for a couple $100 million, that's all documented. Those key parties are there, they're named, they're in the board minutes.
And creditors, are they within terms? So you're a director, you've got a board pack, you're saying, well, gosh, we've got some ageing here, I should ask management questions about that.
Yeah, look, I think most industries they're stretching. A lot of CFOs will stretch to improve their working capital. They'll, especially in the building construction industry, if it's a 30-day trading terms, don't be surprised if they're 45 to 60-day trading terms. Is that a key concern? Look, it is ideally they're within terms, but as long as there's communication with those creditors, you're talking to them, you're not letting it blow out, you're paying bits off, and as Michael mentioned, you're not having a rump at the end of all these liabilities you've accrued, but you've got no way of actually meeting or paying.
Final thoughts, Catchy, on the process. We're 7 years in, going well. What are 2 or 3 things you'd like to see over the next 18 months for this to get better grip?
I think there are a couple of things that are, I think it probably deserves a little bit of more discussion and recognition in relation to how it operates and the confidentiality of the process and the fact that it doesn't have any negative legal consequences. So there's still, a reluctance, I think, to admit, at least in, a listed company or certain sponsors, that there is a real problem.
Suspicion of insolvency.
And I think it's actually good to confront it, and I think it's good to actually, be frank about it. I think the other thing that would be useful is as, Safe Harbour develops, there are probably a range of transactions that people can look to implement as part of their Safe Harbour if they go early enough and if they work diligently on trying to execute something. So one of the things which I think would be good to see would be, erring towards starting early and erring towards starting while there's still capital available to the business to try and restructure. So I think Safe Harbour as sort of a palliative step is not the way to go. It's a proactive step, because if it's too far gone by the time it starts, it's very hard to turn things around. So if, I looked at it and said, has it been successful? Yes, because there's been a lot of companies that have been able to transact that would formerly have been forced to go into an insolvency process. Insolvent trading is a little bit anachronistic. It's the last part of sort of debtor's prison that still exists in our legal system. And it's really prevented it from strangling otherwise viable businesses and causing, the loss of employment and loss of enterprise value. But it sometimes does come in too late, and it sometimes comes in a way in which it's not been as successful as it otherwise could because it's so delayed.
Well, there you have it. Catchy and Macca have signed off on Safe Harbour. They think it's fit for purpose.